Why did Jesus give Peter the keys of the kingdom? Matthew 16 deserves a much closer look. Jesus wasn't just starting a temporary movement, he was building an enduring, structured institution that would outlast him. At Caesarea Philippi, he looks directly at a Galilean fisherman and declares, "I will build my church." Then he gives Peter the keys of the kingdom and authority to bind and loose. That's not a throwaway detail. A simple verbal blessing would have shown favor. So why introduce this confusing legal power? Because in the ancient Davidic kingdom, handing over keys designated a royal steward. While the king was away, that prime minister held absolute, delegated authority to govern the kingdom in his place. Jesus was establishing that exact office to govern his church and preserve truth through unbroken succession, what we call the papacy. So those ancient bronze keys handed to Peter weren't just a metaphor. The structural authority guiding the Catholic Church today is the direct, living continuation of that exact moment. When exactly did Christians first start using the name Catholic Church? A lot of people assume the label was invented during the Middle Ages, or as a reaction to the Protestant Reformation. But here's an ancient Christian receipt. Around the beginning of the 2nd century, an elderly bishop named Ignatius of Antioch wrote a letter. This is his letter to the Smyrnaeans, dating all the way back to AD 107. If we zoom in on the Greek lettering on this ancient document, we find a very specific phrase. Translated into modern English, it reads, "Wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." He used this terminology to describe the faithful long before the Protestant Reformation. Now, this single document doesn't claim to map out every single modern theological doctrine, but it establishes undeniable historical continuity for the early believers. The title Catholic above the doors of your local parish isn't some medieval invention. It's an unbroken linguistic link connecting today's faith to the very first generation after the apostles. Comment early church if you want part 2. But what happens when Christians disagree? Jesus didn't leave us guessing. He established the visible church. He doesn't simply say everyone decides for themselves. Instead, he says, tell it to the church. Christ established a visible community with teaching authority. Think about it. If the church is just an invisible, loose network of individual believers, how do you actually take a theological dispute to them? You can't. An abstract concept cannot hear a case, and it certainly can't issue a verdict. For Jesus' command to be actionable, the church has to be a specific, identifiable community. It needs recognized leaders, gathered in unity, possessing the teaching authority to adjudicate the truth and issue a binding decision. That teaching office is called the magisterium. We see this exact system working in the 1st century, when the apostles gathered in Jerusalem to actively operate as this visible authority, successfully resolving an early doctrinal crisis and restoring unity. So what exactly does this mean for those 2 modern Christians debating today? They don't have to resolve it alone, because Christ established a visible, authoritative community to guide them. Where do we find that authority today? Tell me in the comments. Jesus didn't die and say, start your own church. He founded a church. So which church did he actually establish? Christ didn't just leave behind a set of writings. He gave his authority to a visible group of men. To pass that leadership to the next generation, they used a physical laying on of hands. This direct person-to-person transfer of authority is what we call apostolic succession. Keeping this exact chain intact across 2,000 years of collapsing empires and shifting borders seems impossible. Yet early church records map an unbroken, documented line of continuous bishops, centered entirely on the Bishop of Rome, surviving from the 1st century to the present. Because this physical chain was never broken, the modern church hierarchy holds the exact same authority. So that gathering of apostles from the 1st century didn't just fade into history. The Catholic Church of today is that exact same institution, just 2,000 years older. Watch all 6 clips before deciding. The Catholic claim isn't that Christianity was invented in the Middle Ages. The claim is historical continuity. Jesus, the apostles, their successors, and the church that continued through the centuries. But can that claim survive historical examination? This timeline survives because of a strict physical chain of leadership, a person-to-person transfer of authority across generations, known as apostolic succession. A new leader couldn't just appoint themselves. They had to be physically commissioned by an existing leader. But a single chain is incredibly fragile. If just one leader was killed during the early Roman persecutions before passing the baton, that first-century connection would be permanently lost. So the ancient church mathematically protected the chain. Instead of one continuous thread, multiple existing leaders were required to commission every new one. This created an indestructible, interlocking web of authority. You can track this web to its most heavily documented historical anchor, an unbroken list of 267 leaders, tracing all the way back to St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome. So when a new leader is officially commissioned in the modern era, this massive interlocking web physically links them directly back to the very first century.
How does the modern Catholic Church trace an actual unbroken line back to Christ? It relies on a visible transfer of authority across generations, called apostolic succession, and that historical chain begins in the first century, when Jesus granted authority to the Apostle Peter. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. By giving Peter the keys, Jesus structurally commissioned a leader to govern and teach the early Christian community. That exact authority was then physically handed on. The first apostles ordained the next generation of bishops, like St. Ignatius of Antioch, to continue the mission. And that chain never breaks. The timeline extends through the centuries, creating an unbroken list of popes and bishops filling the gap to the present day. History is chaotic and messy, but ancient Christian manuscripts consistently point to this specific, visible hierarchical structure as the defining mark of the true church. One foundation, direct authority, real leadership, historical proof, unbroken succession. Put the pieces together. Jesus founded a church. He gave Peter the keys. He gave the apostles authority. That church continued through history, and early Christians called it the Catholic Church. That's the Catholic claim: continuity with the church founded by Christ. So here's the question: if not the Catholic Church, which church?